can't expect a change of approach when we look at our new Prime Minister, Liz Truss. She's consistently used incredibly inflammatory rhetoric, calling Putin a rogue operator and saying, "We will keep going further and faster to push Russia out of the whole of Ukraine." In a sense, she is now committing to spend 3% of national income on defence by 2030, which would cost an extra £157 billion. Now that represents the biggest increase since the 1950s. As a report found, there has been a very little attempt to prepare the public, us, for the sacrifices involved in meeting it. Every single one of us will have to make a sacrifice for such a pledge and promise as that. Having already promised £30 billion in tax cuts, the money can only come from even further drastic cuts in public services as we enter the worst recession in a generation. So, also to add to all of this, we now link it to the absolute ridiculous state of the political paradigm here in Britain. And I'm talking about the opposition to the government, or lack of opposition to the government. From the very get-go, Keir Starmer gave his full support for the most confrontational approach to resolving the Ukraine-Russia crisis. And he said yes to pumping more and more and more arms into Ukraine. At the very same time, he launched a blistering attack against the Stop the War Coalition, our very organisation that we're here today, for its anti-war position. It seems ludicrous to me, trying to slam this very organisation as siding with an aggressor. To be clear, which I don't think we need to be clear, but just for the record, we are here against anyone that would be starting any military action over Ukraine, and we support any effort for a diplomatic solution. That has always been the case and will always be the case. But furthermore, Labour MPs, they were threatened with losing the whip if they failed to remove their names from a letter which dared to criticise NATO. Not only are ultimatums like this incredibly dangerous, they're super undemocratic as well. But again, it makes meetings like this even more important. What we're doing is so important, but at the same time, we've now become so familiar with Labour politicians promoting war, basically. We only have to look at previous events. Starmer very quickly from the get-go dodged the facts and figures about NATO's role and record over the last generation in the wars in Yugoslavia, in Afghanistan, in Libya, Iraq. Civilian deaths from all of these wars are running into the thousands and millions, refugees and displaced diasporas across the whole of the world, basically. And Stop the War's message is don't be fooled again and again and again and again. It seems like we have the same arguments over and over and over, but the establishment is simply not listening. And that's why it's so important to continue meetings like this one. Stop the War has been proved right over previous wars, while all of those who have mistakenly supported them have seemed to learn no lessons, but yet we are still seeing the terrible consequences of their errors. The war over Ukraine, involving nuclear powers, could have much more damaging consequences. Diplomacy could lead to a way out. That is what we at Stop the War believe. And we will continue to campaign against war, against the British government's covenants in it, with Labour standing in the shadows obligingly. The war in Ukraine obviously is first and foremost a disaster for the people there, but its impacts are rapidly intensifying around the world, and the repercussions, the economic repercussions here, are so grave that any serious movement has to have opposition to the war as one of its central demands. Pushing for a negotiated settlement and challenging the West's disastrous policy of military escalation are an essential part of averting disaster both here and in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Amy. Thanks so much to travel from London, indeed yesterday, because of the trains and you couldn't get here, which is even more of a good effort, I'd like to say. And also apologies for forgetting that you're also an officer of Stop the War, which I mentioned for the other two speakers. Just before we move on to Jenny, I do want to say, by the way, that I did ask Norman to come and film. He's not just somebody who's randomly walked in with a camera. So I just thought I'd mention that in case anyone was staring, he did ask him to come and film today. So yeah, okay, so over to Jenny now. Jenny.
Thanks, Martin. Great to see you all. I'm not going to be talking so much about NATO. I mean, I will mention it, but just I want to get some thoughts out there, really, about what's going on. Clearly, the cost of living crisis is at the forefront of people's minds, but it's but one of a series of multiplying crises. The Ukraine war, the ongoing pandemic, the climate catastrophe, which has been hitting hard. One crisis accumulates on top of another without resolution, and so political chaos ensues. The global institutions such as the G20, WTO, IMF, the UN are unable to cope, and the post-war system of US leadership is breaking down. Now, on the cost of living, I don't know about you, but the way it's being discussed in the media is completely incomprehensible to me. I do try and listen, but I just can't take it in. How does the price cap work? How are prices determined? What is a spot market? Why are the French doing things differently? I'm not an economist, but there is one thing that I do know, and that is that war and speculation go hand in hand. The Ukraine war and the sanctions are creating shortages, and it's not just the energy monopolies that are raking it in. It's also speculators in these markets that are having a field day, not least because finance is lightly regulated in Britain. We might call for a windfall tax on energy companies, but Liz Truss is introducing further deregulation, giving more free rein to the likes of the hedge funds. Now, on the Ukraine, let's recall that within weeks of Russia's invasion, a peace plan was taking shape in Turkey. Then, recall Biden's speech in Poland on March the 26th, just 1 month later. We must steel ourselves for the long fight ahead. And then Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin clarified the goal, which was fighting to weaken Russia. Now, the US may be focused on Europe now, but China is the longer-term challenge. And according to Ben Wallace, our Defense Secretary, the West has to stand firm on Ukraine because China is watching. In other words, no negotiations, no concessions. Russia must be stopped in order to stop China. So the only interests in this prolongation of war are those of the military industries, the fossil fuels industries, and, as I said, the financiers and speculators. Now, these are the three established pillars of the US economy. Biden's plan is to reverse US decline through war, reviving the economy in this way, building strength while subordinating Europe and its other allies in order to weaken Russia and get ready for a final showdown with its leadership challenge of China. The Ukraine, we are told, is being fought for democracy. No, it's not. It's being fought for the sake of US power. So, Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in August, I think, caused a collective gasp around the world. Oh no, this is the last thing that we need, a US-China war. And by goading China, which was so transparent, it also made it easier for people to recognise how the US and NATO might have goaded Russia. Now, NATO is all over the Pacific. I'm not going to talk in great detail about this because you can read it all in the pamphlet. Just to say that NATO members have been taking part in massive military exercises in the region, and in June, Japan, Australia and South Korea attended the NATO summit in Madrid, where China was designated a threat to the rules-based order, whatever that may be, but obviously designed in the interest of the West. Now, ever since AUKUS was introduced, you remember AUKUS, the pact between the US, the UK and Australia, ever since this was announced a year ago, the tensions in the region have increased. AUKUS aims to equip Australia with nuclear-powered submarines. Nuclear-powered submarines have a far, far longer range capacity and can reach from Australia right into the Taiwan Strait. China sees AUKUS as an Asian NATO and is worried that Japan and South Korea will join. and it has stepped up its military exercises in the vicinity since October. Now, China's claim to Taiwan goes back to the end of World War II, when the Allies agreed that Chinese territories seized and colonised by Japan should be returned, and they specifically named Taiwan. In a UN resolution in 1971, this recognised China as, the People's Republic of China, as the only legitimate government of China. But then Taiwan has been self-ruled since 1949, when the nationalist government fled to the island, having lost the civil war on the mainland, and in 1992 a system of electoral democratic elections was established. Nevertheless, I would argue that the Taiwan issue should not be viewed through a democracy versus autocracy lens. Like Ukraine, Taiwan is being used as a bargaining chip by the US and NATO. No doubt many people think we should stand in solidarity with the Taiwan independence movement, but I would say, would you think then that it's okay for Taiwan to formalise its alliance with the US? Would it be okay for Taiwan to join NATO? Self-determination under a high degree of autonomy is a different matter. It's legitimate, China has said it wants to work for, under the UN, and it is in fact what... Now, NATO getting involved in the Pacific is precisely to build up a coordinated military strength to prevent China from reunifying with Taiwan. China's military response to the Pelosi visit is being used to once again label China as the aggressor, just as in the 1951 Korean War. Now, Truss hauled the Chinese ambassador in to accuse him of aggression. I ask you, China has not fought a war in 40 years, and when has Britain not actually been fighting overseas wars? Maybe you have to go back to the Crusades? Truss actually wants to upgrade China's rating to acute threat on a par with Russia. Not even Biden has gone so far yet. And she also talks of arming Taiwan. She needs to step up on two fronts, in Europe and in the Pacific, hence the proposed eye-watering increases in our military budget. Also planned is a massive increase in intelligence and security services, with Tom Tugendhat, the well-known anti-China hawk, as the Ministry for Security, focusing no doubt on rooting out Chinese spying. So if you're Chinese or doing business or research with China, things may get a little difficult. And then, of course, they've got to keep an eye on us. With Truss appointing her closest supporters into key ministerial posts, the warmongers are now in control. I wonder if we will look back on this in years to come as a moment similar to that in Germany, when Hitler came to power backed by the most reactionary section of finance capital invested in the old economy, wresting leadership from more liberal-minded business groups and going on to build a war faction. Maybe I'm over-dramatising. But at any rate, Truss and her faction are dangerous as well as delusional in their notion of global Britain once again ruling the waves. People in this country are no doubt thinking now, this is a really bad time, but we'll get through it. We've done it before. I hope that there is some respite, but I'm not holding my breath. This is not a typical capitalist crisis. Busts will not bounce back easily into boom. Tax cuts to grow the economy are simply delusional. It's also daunting, but maybe there's some room for hope. The vast majority of the world are giving up on US leadership. They're not interested in the US proxy war. They know the West's hypocrisy. Like us, they don't think Russia is right, but they're not supporting arms supplies and sanctions, and they don't want to fall out with China. And that's just the government. The people, they're seething against America and the West. The vaccine hoarding, the failure to cough up the measly $100 billion promised for climate change 7 years ago. And now the dollar is rising when they're hooked up to the eyes in debt and will have to shell out more in debt repayment. I'm talking about low-income countries here. And it's becoming more and more clear that US leadership of the world system is not working for the people. Here in Britain, we have to shatter the delusions. This is Earth to Major Truss. Get real. Cut your militarism, the cost, the waste. Cut cut your global brick plans and face it. The UK is a great power, no more. No way must working people be made to pay for all of this. We must resist, and under our pressure, the ties of the strangulation by the United States may start to give, and we can start talking peace. Thank you.
A second national religion, where there's a consensus that you can't talk about it, you can't analyse it, and you certainly can't blame it for anything that has gone wrong in the world. But we have to break through that sort of wall of silence. For one reason, I think more than any other. We are in the shadow of the danger of nuclear conflict.
Yeah.
Now, in all the previous times I've come to Manchester, I've been speaking about Afghanistan or Iraq or Libya, dreadful wars which have scarred this century. But at none of those meetings could I really plausibly say this could become a nuclear conflict. It simply wasn't on the agenda, wasn't a likelihood. But today, day in, day out, we are getting softened up to the idea that nuclear war could happen. Of course, they all say Putin might start it, and conceivably Putin might. It's not impossible. But he is not saying that. It is the West is saying a nuclear war could break out, and then how will we, NATO, respond? And the fact that this is now becoming normalised, that it's been put on the agenda as something that could happen, and you talk about how you can win a nuclear war, that on its own should indicate how essential it is that we break through the silence that is being imposed on these issues, the bipartisan silence. Now, this is, the war in Ukraine, a NATO war. There are other reasons underlying it too, to do with the way in which the Soviet Union broke up and the fact that internal boundaries within the Soviet Union didn't really make much difference whether you were in Ukraine or Russia, then you were all governed from Moscow, became interstate boundaries. And we're seeing that between Armenia and Azerbaijan at the moment, if you've not noticed that, another war rumbling on there in the former Soviet territory. But the main factor that has brought about this war, rooted as it is in some of those problems, has been the relentless expansion of NATO. Now, NATO was set up, presumably, or allegedly, to prevent the Red Army sweeping through Europe and ending up on the English Channel before we knew where we were. The Soviet Union wound up in 1991, the Warsaw Pact at the same time. And at the time, American leaders were saying to Gorbachev, we won't expand NATO an inch. In fact, the logic would be no Soviet Union, no Warsaw Pact, no Red Army, no NATO. This basic mission had been accomplished, if you like. But instead, it was extended and extended and extended, not anymore to oppose communism, but as an instrument of US hegemony, US domination, as it moved east in Europe. But that's only one way in which NATO changed. It's not only extended, it's taken the most elastic view possible as to what constitutes the North Atlantic, because it now pops up in all parts of the world, a long, long way from the North Atlantic. But also it has become an overtly aggressive organisation. Now, before 1991, NATO actually never fought any wars. America did, God knows, and Britain as well. But NATO, as such, could still claim to be a defensive alliance. It didn't actually start any aggressions under its own banner. Since then, the war in Yugoslavia, 1999, that was a NATO war undertaken without United Nations sanction and in defiance of international law. The 20-year occupation of Afghanistan, beginning in 2001, now ended in humiliating disaster. That was a NATO operation. And the war in Libya, which has had equally disastrous consequences, a shattered society, a huge refugee crisis, civil wars still going on, that was done by NATO. None of these wars arose from Afghanistan or Yugoslavia or Libya threatening a NATO country, therefore invoking the defensive provisions of NATO. They were acts of aggression, extending the hegemony of the United States and its allies. And of course Iraq, not formally a NATO operation, but the two main NATO military powers, the USA and Britain, up to their necks in blood. So we've seen disastrous wars throughout this century under the banner of NATO. And so it is hardly surprising that Russia would feel we are being threatened by this extension of NATO. And of course the same forces that are extending NATO up to the Russian border, they're very active in the Pacific. I mean, Jenny has now outlined that comprehensively, but we are seeing now a new Cold War directed at China and Russia with NATO as one of its principal elements. And if we don't recognise that, we haven't a clue either understanding what's going on in the world today or bringing these wars to an end. Now, we said that, and Shadi has outlined it clearly. Stop the War opposed Russia's military action. It is possible to understand something without justifying it. And the damage that has been caused, the immense loss of life, that cannot be justified by the reasons given by Putin, and his reasons sort of seem to vary with time as what he's actually trying to achieve. There's a gross breach of international law. It's had disastrous consequences for Ukraine. It's also been completely counterproductive. America now in NATO has a new sense of purpose in Europe. American domination over its allies is reinforced. Sweden and Finland are joining. And even if Ukraine doesn't join NATO now, it can hardly be more integrated into the war apparatus of the United States and its allies. So we've opposed that war, but we want to bring it to an end. And that makes us very different to Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, because everything they have done is to try and prolong it. Any whisper of negotiations opening up, peace talks, they're off to Kiev, the drop of a hat, to say, no you don't talk peace, don't try and come to an understanding with Russia on the basis of the Minsk agreements that had been signed after 2014 to try and deal with the divisions in the east of Ukraine. Don't make any concessions at all. We will supply you with more arms, keep the war going, we want to weaken Russia. That's all they are about. Obstructing diplomacy, pouring in arms, and actually controlling this war. It is a proxy war. It is a proxy war. I've just read an article in the New York Times today, which outlines how this recent offensive around Kharkiv by the Ukrainian army was directed by American and British intelligence and American and British officers. They're not just sending in the arms and saying, you guys get on with it. They're saying, we will tell you what to do. We give you they are directing this war. So, I mean, it is a proxy war, but with the proxy element getting pretty bloody thin by now. It is really a war that, and this is what makes it so dangerous, that because it is a proxy war with a proxy element very thin indeed now, that it can so easily escalate. Now we're being told, well, isn't it great? Ukraine has won, large territories where the Russian army should never have been to begin with. So I'm not going to regret the Russian army being driven out of those territories. But I would say two things. The first is, I cannot bring myself to become a cheerleader for the Ukrainian government, which God knows Putin is an authoritarian dictator, but the Ukrainian government, which has banned every left-wing party in Ukraine, which has outlawed trade unionism for 70% of the Ukrainian working people, and has within it people who are animated by a huge hatred of Russians. Not just the Russians that are invading, but the Russians that live in Ukraine. So I don't think this is not a victory for democracy. The second thing is, it is not, in my view, likely to bring the war to an early end. Russia still controls very large areas of Ukraine, I think about 20% of its territory, and the likelihood still is of some military standoff being prolonged well into next year and possibly beyond. So this does not mean the war's about to come to an easy end. And we are all victims of the war. We're not victims like the Ukrainians are. That would be entirely wrong to suggest that. But we're victims in that we are paying economically at a time when there's enough crisis going on already. This is making it even worse. Shadia and Jenny have described the impact on the cost of living crisis, but the economic disruption, which most of the world wants nothing to do with. Even countries that do not endorse Russia's invasion of Ukraine do not endorse the sanctions either, because sanctions have been used by America as an instrument of foreign policy on one issue after another: China, Russia, Iran, and ordinary people pay the price for these disruptions. And the idea that the cost of living crisis is going to be solved without the war and peace crisis being solved is an illusion. And the prospect opening up gets still worse. Even if we don't have a nuclear war, even if there isn't an escalation, and it could so easily happen. Say Ukraine want to take their offensive into Crimea, which Russia has annexed. It's Russian territory now in the eyes of the Russian government. So easy for that without escalation. But even if we don't have that, what prospects do we have as a society? Liz Truss has said she wants to increase military spending from 2% of GDP to 3% of GDP over the next few years. That's an increase of about £160 billion being spent on defence, more than what has been spent already in the coming few years. The Labour Party supports that. There's even people like this journalist Paul Mason, who's quite influential. He says we should go to between 3 and 5%. Well, let's take the middle, 4%. That is £320 billion more. Now, what does this mean? Well, I don't have to tell you, because the Royal United Services Institute, which is an organisation as respectable as it sounds, with Royal and Services in there, they are saying, if Liz Truss, who has been now, I think, outbid by elements in the Labour movement, God help us, if Liz Truss's plan is implemented, it could only be done by putting income tax up by 5%, 5 pence in the pound, or by implementing the most huge cuts in other areas of public spending. Now, I think no Conservative government, certainly probably no government at all, is going to put up income tax by 5%. So we will be looking to pay for this, huge increase in a swollen militaristic budget. We would be having to put up with cuts in education, in welfare, in health, in everything that makes a society civilised. And that is a prospect that has been held out before us. And it's justifiable. I mean, we need to deter Russia. Well, I have to say, Russia's military performance is not such as would really be keeping one awake at night if one's in Britain at the moment. The idea that this is needed is simply not plausible. It's about remilitarising the economies to intimidate other states, to confront China above all, to put some muscle behind this Cold War, regardless of the impact on living standards for ordinary people. And this is coming, after, well, we've now had, 14 years since the economic crash, 14 years of stagnant living standards. Then we've had the pandemic, now we've got the cost of living crisis, and real wages are starting to fall, and they're not falling from a position where previously they were rising. They've been flatlining for 14 years. And now we're talking about piling war preparations at vast expense on top of this heap of misery. And we now have a generation that's never known improvements in social conditions. They've only known austerity and war. And pursuing war means more austerity on top of the austerity that we've already had. And we need to oppose this. I mean, I'll end up where I started. We have, unfortunately, a sort of consensus of ignoring these facts, ignoring this perspective that has been outlined in front of us. But Keir Starmer, he's leader of the opposition. The only words there that make sense are of and thee, as he doesn't oppose and he doesn't lead. And on this issue, he tries to be even more bellicose than the most bellicose government in the NATO alliance, the British government. And, you know, he's, Charlie said, you know, he's intimidated his own left wing into being silent on this, the most important issue in world politics today. And I don't know why. If Charlotte's got the strength and the moral courage to walk away from her job on a point of principle, why we can't find a few MPs, other than Jeremy Corbyn, who stood firm, who will actually do the same. But the fact is, we have a wall of political silence supporting these disastrous policies, which, bad as they are in their impact right now, only offer us worse, stretching indefinitely into the future, which is why it falls to us. It falls to stop the war. And we're being attacked a lot, but we're being attacked for a reason. It's because they know, they've seen in the course of this century the potential strength of an anti-war movement, the potential strength of people demonstrating and fighting for peace. And if we link the fight for peace with these vital issues of people's living standards and the social degradation we are facing, if we can bring those issues together, we can form an opposition, whether anyone in Parliament likes it or not, and we can affect the changes to give our children and grandchildren a better prospect than the one they've been facing at the moment.
Thank you. Okay, Evan?
Yeah, questions and just quick points. First of all, I think Andrew did mention about, I think one of the other speakers did, about when NATO was formed. Just a sort of interesting historic point about this, which might or might not interest people, but when NATO was formed, it was Labour was in power, and two Labour MPs actually had the whip taken off them. I think one or maybe both of them were expelled from the party. One of them actually became later became the MP for Manchester Gordon, a guy called Connie Siliakis. You know, just a little historic point there. A question which to all the speakers, I think, is, and particularly to Andrew, is one thing that I've come across over and over and over again when I've had arguments with people, both face-to-face and online, is a denial about NATO's involvement as NATO in both the war in Yugoslavia over Kosovo, though it started over Kosovo, and in Libya, in spite of the fact that the evidence, you know, they're just facts, you know, they're very, very simple facts. So I just wondered why is it that so many people seem to believe that NATO wasn't involved, and it was just it was a collection of countries that all decided just to sort of randomly get together and get involved in that. On the repression in Ukraine, I don't know if people are aware of this, but a couple of brothers, who are young members of the Ukrainian Communist Party, were arrested quite near the start of this, and as far as I'm aware, there's still no proper knowledge of what's happened to them. The Greek Communist Party's MEPs brought this up in the European Parliament, and the European Union has done absolutely, none of the people who ought to be responsible for doing anything about this have done anything about it. And finally, just a point that I've made on a number of occasions recently on what Andrew said about this thing about understanding as opposed to support. When I was growing up, and I think it's still been studying history at school, and I think it's pretty much still a common thing, the rise of Hitler in Germany was blamed on the unfair a large part of it on the unfair nature of the Treaty of Versailles and what was imposed on Germany. So does that mean that everybody who suggests that, who actually says that now, can be described as a supporter of Hitler? It's just a bizarre way of evading politics, and a frightening one as well, because it just takes away any opportunity to be able to have an objective discussion.
That's massively correct. I'll come to you in a second. I mean, as a parent of someone who did A-level history a couple of years ago, and if someone who's doing GCSE history this year, they still do ask that question, and I'm not aware that anyone's called a Nazi apologist when they answer it. So indeed, yeah. Okay, the comrade there, and then we'll come back to the panel, and I think Ross had his hand up.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I agree with a lot of what's been said by the speakers. Sorry I missed your talk, most of it. But the Iraqi comrade said, war is a continuation of politics. So you're calling for peace and end to the war, which is great. But unless we end the politics, then the politics continue. So we're against the war, but what are we for? The politics that is behind this war is the politics of imperialism. It is not only US imperialism, but also British imperialism. As you said yourself, there are British military advisors in Ukraine, advising the Ukrainians, directing them, just like there are British military forces in Yemen, directing the Saudis as they bomb Yemen, right? So the British are involved up to their necks. The British have their own interests to defend. The biggest banks in the world are British, the biggest oil companies in the world are British as well. So it is imperialism, which is the high state of capitalism, that is at the roots of this problem, not just war, but poverty. Someone mentioned lack of vaccines, lack of healthcare, lack of medicines being hoarded by rich countries, climate change. The imperialists are behind it. So, what are we for? We have to build a movement against this, a movement for an alternative to imperialism, an alternative to capitalism, a movement for socialism, right? We have to fight for socialism, and that is what will be the counterpoint to the superpowers. We have to fight for socialism in this country. We have to support those people who are already fighting against imperialism, like the Palestinian resistance, like the Cuban Revolution, or the Venezuelan Revolution, right? Where people are fighting against imperialism, we have to support them. And even if people are fighting in this country, like there was a protest against racism yesterday, over the weekend in London, against the police killing the black man, we should be supporting those protests. And through these little battles, both at home and abroad, we're going to build the movement that opposes the imperialists. And the imperialists include, talking from a British point of view, both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party and the Lib Dems. All these political parties are imperialists. They support Britain's global interests. They support the City of London. They support the war in Ukraine. They support demonizing China, demonizing Russia, demonizing Cuba, demonizing Venezuela. So they're the enemy. The Labour Party, part of our enemy in this fight. We have to fight for socialism, otherwise we're lost.
We'll go back to the panel, and then we'll come to, we've got Ross, we've got Ron, and the guy there as well. So, do you want to, should we go the other way around this time? Should we Andrew, and then we'll go Jenny and Shelley.
Yeah, fine. On the first point made by the Iraqi comrade, what we have instead of NATO. The demand, at least as far as Europe was concerned, was for a common security framework that brought in all countries and was under the domination of none. Because the thing is, security has to be all-inclusive, or it isn't security. You know, if some people feel threatened and made insecure by the security arrangements, well then you haven't got security. It's got to be everyone or no one, really. That was what was advocated at the end of the Cold War. And that could have been even 15 years ago. Could have been a possibility. I mean, Putin talked about Russia joining NATO, in which case NATO would have become that sort of security because NATO wouldn't let him. So I think there have to be international security arrangements that acknowledge everyone's interests, bring everyone together, not blocks under the domination of one particular power. I think the second comrade to speak he asked why is NATO's role denied? Well, I think there's a lot of investment in this myth of NATO as a defensive alliance that doesn't do aggression. I mean, the facts are against it, so the facts are simply ignored. And people often don't remember whether NATO was involved or not. I mean, they know that Britain and France were involved in the attack on Libya, and the Americans were as well on Yugoslavia. So there's anything they can get away with. The fact is that NATO now exists as an integrated military command structure, and they use it. They use it, not just as its original purpose was to deter an attack on any NATO member. Because whatever you think of Colonel Gaddafi, he wasn't about to launch an attack on any NATO member in 2011. And the final comment he spoke about imperialism. Broadly, I agree with what he has said. War does emerge from imperialism, and particular wars can be stopped by the action of the people. The whole tendency towards war will not be uprooted until imperialism is defeated.
Yeah.
Having said that, in Stop the War, we've always said we're opposing wars. We want to bring people together on the broadest possible basis, because other people have other, perspectives. Whether it's pacifist or support for the United Nations. And if you're against a particular war, we want you marching with us. We don't say that you have to share the analysis of imperialism that comrades outlined and that I personally would share. I mean, certainly, in the end, you can only look to a solution of these problems through changing the social system. I wrote the book, it's not been mentioned before. Is socialism possible in Britain? Spoiler alert, I say yes. And that is, but if we're talking about Jeremy Corbyn and so on, the thing that the right wing of the Labour Party, the media, the establishment, the state hated most about him was his anti-imperialism. If you want to talk about nationalising the water industry, well, people can still debate it. You're not going to have a coup in this country because you nationalise the water industry. But the fact that he was sceptical about NATO, opposed to nuclear weapons, Britain's position on nuclear weapons, stood in solidarity with the Palestinian people, stood in solidarity with anyone fighting imperialism around the world, they could not abide that because it is an arrow at the heart of British politics, conventional British politics. And that was one of the extraordinary things about him and why I was certainly proud to work with him. So, that's awesome.
Thank you, Andrew. Jenny?
Yeah, so I think two people mentioned Clausewitz there. That's not the only philosophy, There are others. For example, the Chinese philosopher Sun Tzu, I can't remember what century it was, but probably around 4 BC or something, who talked about winning without fighting. And you just got to go and watch a film with Bruce Lee and you see how to win without fighting, or at least, he fought defensively, he never started. So there are other ways of thinking about things. And I remember when, right at the very beginning, when Jeremy became the leader of the Labour Party, leader of the Labour Party, and they were trying to put him in an awkward position and asking him all these questions about would he bow to the Queen and all of this kind of thing. One of the questions he was asked was about NATO. And he said, well, yeah, he said, okay, NATO, but perhaps we need to think about developing relationships with other powers as well. And then you can see this, well, there's a way out here, we could just sort of transition away by multiplying our relations around the world. And I still think that that is a very good way of thinking about things. You know, the world is changing, and this is the problem. You know, the world is changing. You know, the balance of power is shifting. It's been concentrated for 200 years in the West, and it is now shifting. It's moving away, it's moving towards the East, it's moving from the North to the global South. And this is going to take a long time, but you know, in 20 or 30 years, for example, if we look at the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, in about 20 years' time, they will be larger than the G7. You know, this is just going to happen. It's going to happen. You can't stop it. And so this puts us in a changed position, and we have to think about this. And the problem is that, as we've talked about, we have these imperial delusions. We're completely, utterly delusional that we think that we can reverse the retreat from Suez, that we think that we can rule the waves. This whole idea of global Britain is completely to cock. And it's similarly, as I said, the approach to the cost of living crisis. I mean, for God's sake, did anybody try and listen to Sunak and Truss? I couldn't make head nor tail of what they were saying. They were talking gobbledygook. They weren't talking to people about a solution. And we have to make the politicians get real. If it's not them, you know, the Labour politicians, if it's not them, we have to find our own. And we just need to get real and say, what are our problems? What are our opportunities? And how are we going to move forward?
Thank you. Shadi?
I can add really well to what Jenny's saying, is get real and see what the problems are, see what the solutions are. Talking directly to you in terms of expanding this in terms of the fight for socialism. That's exactly what the anti-war movement is all about. These things are completely interlinked. In fact, they're inextricably linked. And it's all about connecting these dots. When I first joined Stop the War Coalition, I was 18, just joined university, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I can't afford a pint, I can't afford my travel, I can't afford my accommodation. These are all of a political nature, and they can all be linked to a wider agenda when you look further abroad, and you think, okay, all of these billions of pounds are being pumped into wars abroad, but the things like education, welfare, NHS, they're all being ignored. All of our problems, as members of society and members of socialism and socialist causes, they are of all a political nature. And that's when you can really get real to relate to people on something that means something to them. Right now we are all terrified about the cost of living crisis, particularly when we're seeing a rise in energy bills. And yes, absolutely, when anybody in charge of it is talking absolute jargon, it's up to us to translate it, but also translate the solutions too. As I say, as an 18-year-old, I was worried about a pint. Now my worries are obviously a lot bigger than a pint, but still worries about a pint too. If pints went up in the same as the rise of inflation, a pint would be 25 quid. So now we're all getting a bit worried about even a pint. And when we put this into a context of a war on a global scale, the world is absolutely terrifying. So I think it's about connecting the dots from all of these different movements that we are all involved in. You talked about Palestinian resistance, you talked about the stand-up to racism, institutional racism on the streets that was misrepresented by mainstream media, by Sky News, calling the protest for Chris as people marching towards Buckingham Palace. And then they had to issue an apology. I mean, that's absolutely scandalous, coming from apparently the propaganda puppet herself. So really, we have to challenge all of these different things and translate them, but it's all about socialism. Absolutely, that's the heart of our anti-war movement, to connect these dots and continue to stand shoulder to shoulder.
Thank you. Yeah. It's worth commenting, in fact, when we think about Western imperialism, particularly in the Middle East. It's just made me think, Johnny, you talking about being 18. This has been going on since I was a student, because actually the first invasion of Iraq, the one at the start of the 90s, was when I was in my final year, and I'm in my 50s. And that's quite a thought, really, isn't it? To how the West has been messing around invading parts of the Middle East. Okay, I've got 4 more names down at the moment, so I'm going to take some more contributions from the floor, and then I'll take you fifth, and then we'll come back. Ross, over to you.
Yeah, well, well, just thank you very much for coming and speaking. It's been brilliant and enlightening. And I suppose I was just going to comment that I think for me the beauty of Stop the War is it is a genuine and has a track record of being a united front, that does really unite people of different politics. And I think that's part of my question really, which is, funnily enough, I was at Unison Health Conference and I was at a fringe meeting that looked a bit like Stop the War, wasn't Stop the War. I don't really want to get into any sectarian point, but it was a slightly, the delivery of it was quite lively, but it sounded a little bit neutral, the speaker. He was sort of saying that, I'm sorry, I can't remember his name, but again, I don't really want to get into a sectarian point, but he was kind of saying quite rightly, like everyone's saying, that imperialism is the problem and it's turf wars and it's capitalism played out in a gruesome, bloody way. And I was sort of making the point that, I've become more horrified and galvanised by the fact that there are Nazis in Ukraine, that Nazi as a battalion are on television, that things are on Twitter, and even just in the Ukraine, I think something Andrew alluded to about, and Evans alluded to about the disgraceful treatment of the left and banning left parties and so forth. And I'm just trying to make sense of something. I think the speaker kind of tried to suggest that I was erring towards Putin-type propaganda by, using the denazifying argument. But I think I might be mixing up my ideas a little bit. But of course, in England, I think people get confused about what fascism is, who Nazis are, and people can be deplatformed for very, very minor offences on the progressive left. We've seen this happen to comrades in the RNT, it's ongoing, and it's a way of weaponising things. So I suppose my question is a genuine one, which is, can we be horrified and articulate things in terms of what horrifies us about the ideology of fascism and Nazism? My dad brought me up to believe that my grandfather was fighting in World War II against the Nazis, and of course, fast forward years later, and the people who are patriotic kind of are right wing. And we all know, bring the argument back the other way, we all know what Churchill, after the war, what he did to the communists in Greece, so it goes to show that we use that propaganda really. But I suppose it's just a question about, can we reduce it to economics, capitalism, or do we really have to think about those ideologies, and that's what I said.
That's Ross. Okay, over to Ron, and then the guy next to Ross.
Yeah, when the wars break out, the causes of the war had taken place much earlier. That's not to say that something happened one day and they go to war the next day. It doesn't happen like that. We saw during the First World War, and we did a lot of Stop the War meetings, in the Iraqi war. I remember asking people, what was the cause of the First World War? And people start scratching their heads, saying, was it the Archduke got shot? Was it this or that? Nobody was quite sure. But I'll tell you, millions of people were very sure in 1914 when they were told that their life was being threatened by other countries, but the Germans were threatening the English English were threatening the Germans and all of that. That's how they were treated. They're very clever at getting you to go to war and demonizing other people. And there's no two ways about it. The war in Ukraine did not have to happen. They pushed and pushed for NATO. Right when he had the troops on the border, he was looking for some sort of way out, some sort of deal over there. But they would offer nothing because they were determined, one, they wanted to break Russia, and they openly say this. They were determined to break Russia, but they want a big message to China. You're next. This is how we're going to deal with people who don't fall in line with the United States. Now, imperialism is this. It's the imperialist power get into an area and they control it. And they can stop other people coming into the area. That's why they fight in the Middle East for the oil, to keep others out. The U.S. don't need oil. It's to keep others out. And that's what imperialism is about. It's to drive for profit. Each is driven. And they don't care whether you live or whether you die, whether you tell the truth or whether you lie. That's all they care about. And this is what we've got to say in the Stop the War. They had listened to us 10 years ago. When the build-up of the war with the Ukraine, there wouldn't have been a war because we've been shouting about it for 10 years. Now, and those of us on the left have been shouting about it. This war can take place if it carries on like this. And we don't want to make the same mistake that the socialists made in 1914. They said, we're against the war, until war was declared, and then they collapsed, and they went and supported their own rotten government, just like Labour is doing today. The only solution to the First World War was revolution. That's what happened. The working class, particularly in Russia, organized, mobilized against the war for